Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another online portrait drawing session. This video mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs on the screen, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 minutes and one for 30 minutes, and it's your job to draw the photograph that you see. Lizet will be joining us. She'll be doing a demonstration in the bottom corner of the screen and giving hints and tips. Once you've finished, don't forget to post your work to Instagram and hashtag it with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everybody and welcome to another Raw Umber video. I'm Lizet and I will be drawing along with you today. So as Neil has said before, we will be drawing a 10-minute, 20 and finally a 30-minute pose. And I will be using charcoal pencil with chalk and a rubber. I will link to all the materials I use down below, but as always, feel free to use whatever materials you prefer. This session, I'd like to focus a little bit more on likeness. Now, I want to explain some things about likeness, so I'm going to start with a very simple box shape with a cross in the middle. So our model is looking towards the right, so we're going to see her in profile. And I want to first talk to you a bit about common proportions of the head. So very commonly, you'll see that the nose to brow to forehead is an equal 3/3. So that's the ideal proportion of a face. Now, everyone is a little bit different, so this is not always true for everyone, but it's good to go for that first and then see how people are different. The next thing I do is I place the angles of the head, so she's looking up a bit. So I'm going to just change my box a little bit more angled and put in the ear. And so the ear is always between the nose and the brow, as well as being placed right behind that cross shape. And that midpoint is also the midpoint of the skull. So when you take a skull, you might see that there's a big arch going from the ear hole all the way to the bottom of the eye socket, and that's called the zygomatic arch. And this point you can use as a nice midpoint for the skull. And that will be where the eye socket starts. Another thing to keep in mind with proportions of faces is that the eye socket will usually be 1/3 down from the ear. So you can fit the eye socket in almost exactly 3 times between the start of the ear and the front of the forehead. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly draw a skull here, just to show you some things that are very common in people, or that basically everybody has, and then we can work on the likeness from there. So I've put in that zygomatic arch, and now I'm just putting in the jawline. And you can also see that that midpoint is really, really useful because it's not only the bottom of the eye socket, it's also the midpoint of the skull. And from that point onwards, you can also see that's the back of the skull right there. So it's a really useful point to have. Okay, so now we have a generic skull in, and this is what everybody has. Last week, for people who are here last week as well, I mentioned the Loomis books. Now, Loomis was a really good illustrator from the 50s, the golden years of illustration. And he coined this way of looking at skulls as if they are made of clay. So he said, imagine that this skull that you've just drawn is made of clay and you've got 4 boards, one on the top, one on the back and one on the front. And you can see how they're pressing against that skull. And if you can sort of visualize that, you can imagine that you could press down the skull in certain ways. So for instance, if I take this flat plane from the front and I angle that, you could see I could take the whole jaw and bring that towards that line. And that will change the complete character of that skull, of that person. And so you can see the line is now way more angled and less straight than what we had before. And the same thing you can do with the back. For instance, if I take that line, I bring that in like there. So I push that back of the skull inwards, and then we get a more pointy sort of head. So these big lines are really useful when you're figuring out portraiture. Now, for instance, I myself have a bit of a pointy head, so let's just emulate that. So now I'm just taking that line and bring that in. And you see that's straight away a completely different person again. This looks like someone with maybe a smaller face, maybe a weaker chin, that sort of thing. So this does a lot for likeness. So let's have a look at what the other features do. So if I just put like a nose and some lips on top there, very simply. So first, let me just look at our model. And as you can see, her line sort of goes, her forehead is behind her chin. So you can imagine that straight line there. So I'm just going to change it to that. Okay, so I hope that that plane thing is clear for everybody. Do let me know in the comments if it's not quite clear, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But in the meantime, let's start breaking down each section of the skull now. So of course the planes are very important, but they're not everything. So I'm going to start with the forehead. So for instance, if you've got somebody whose line of the forehead to the chin is more straight, what you can do is just take that line, make it straighter, and then fill in the forehead so it fills that up. Now this is not the case with our model, so I will take this back, but I just want to show you what's the main difference between a sloping forehead and a forehead that's a bit more protruding. Now if we take the section of the nose, we can make her nose concave, so it kind of goes up. Or maybe slightly the other way, so it actually sort of a big curve outwards. So in her case, she's got kind of a straight nose, so I'm going to use that. And now let's look at the lower section of her face and how you can change that. So someone can have the lower lip further out than their top lip, for instance. Or they can have their lower lip further back. And that again gives a completely different character. In her case, she's sort of pretty much the same, so that's what I'm going to draw. Okay, so that's the forehead, nose, and lips. So now let's have a look at the eye socket. So as you can see, the eye socket is sort of a square, but you can also change that to suit the person. So some people, for instance, will have more squashed eye sockets, so they might be a bit lower than average and a bit wider. So as we're running out of time, I'm not going to show you all the different shapes of the eye sockets and that sort of thing, but I hope this sort of gives you an idea of how you can change the likeness for each person. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the face down a little bit more so you can see how this all relates to finishing a drawing. So the next thing I'm going to look for is the angle versus the nose to the bottom of our eye socket. Is that a straight slope? Is it wider? If someone has wide nostrils, that line will be, of course, more angled, so in this case a little bit straighter. In her case, it almost slopes exactly the same way as the front of her nose. So we can use that to see how wide her nose is in relation to her eye socket. So as you can see, this is a really nice way, or I think at least it's a very nice way of figuring out the shape, the character of someone's face. I am going to cheat a little bit and just show you a quick jump ahead of this drawing where I've added a little bit of hair, and hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit of a likeness and how that relates to all the angles and shapes that I've been explaining. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know in the comments if you found that helpful in any way, and if you have any questions. And I will see you in a second for the 20-minute pose. Okay, so here we are for the 20-minute pose. So this pose is a little bit more tricky because she is looking up. So I'm going to be using my box method, which I find really useful for angled portraits. Have a look at my how to draw a head video for anyone new after this to see how I construct these heads. But in the meantime, don't worry, I will be explaining how I did it in this video as well. First, what I'm going to start with is the angle of her head. So I want to know if she's angling a little bit more towards the left or to the right. And so you can see that her eyes, the left corner of her eye is a little bit higher than the one on the right. So if you take those two corners and you imagine a line across there, you can see that that line is actually angled a little bit. So that's what I'm going to use as my indicator of what angle her head is at the moment. The same thing goes for the midline, so the center line. We can take a line from the middle of her brows, so just the middle in between there, all the way to the bottom of her chin. So you can see a straight line on that as well, and that I use to figure out the center line, and that sort of also helps me to see which way she is angling there. So whenever I can, I will use the eyes for that, but that's not always possible. So sometimes I can also use the nostrils or the corners of the lips. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at how much she is turned away from us. So if you have a 3/4 head, very important to know that that far away side of the head is the right space. So what I'm trying to do here is I measure how wide it is from the tip of from the middle of the nose, and I compare that to the height of her nose to her brow, and as you can see, that's a perfect square. So I'm going to use that as my measurement to see what I base everything else on. The next thing I'm going to do is figure out how tall her skull is. This is not including the hair, because we'll add that later. And if you look at the chin to the nose and take that measurement again, you can see that it's pretty much halfway. So I'm going to use that as my reference point to know how tall her head is. And then because she's going upwards, I'm going to angle my box upwards. If this was a class with homework, if I could give you one homework assignment, it would be to draw boxes from all angles. It's just so useful to be able to draw a box from different perspectives. So that way you learn how to angle a head or any object that you want to draw at the angle that you want it to do. Because it's easier to draw, I mean, it's still hard, but it's easier to draw a head that's looking straight at you and it's not angled anyway. But the minute someone's head goes upwards or downwards, everything is placed in a certain perspective and makes it so much harder to draw. So I would really recommend that's something to look at. And just take your mobile phone and draw it in several places and see how it changes the angles when you look upward or downward from it. And it just really helped me to figure out how to draw heads anyway. Anyway, back to the drawing. Enough talk. So what I do now is I put that cross in to figure out where the midpoint is, and as hoped it is definitely the bottom of the nose, so that's great. And then to make sure that I've got an idea of where her mouth is and her eyes. So because she's looking up, the rule of birds is a bit different. So you'll see more of her chin because that angles towards us and less of her forehead. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place those things first. Now, going back to likeness, at the moment, her head is very much a box shape. Now, similarly to what we did in a 10-minute pose, in this pose as well, we can use those shapes to create a likeness. So, for instance, at the moment, her brow line is just as wide as her cheekbone line, which is just as wide as her chin. So I think, in fact, that she does have quite a wide chin, but it's a lot more narrow than what we have at the moment. So I'm going to start narrowing this down. The same thing goes for her forehead. Her forehead could be sloping back a little bit more, like I just did, or it could be a little bit more wide. And these angles say a lot about someone's skull shape. And I'll continue to talk about that in a second as well. I'm just going to place a little bit more of the features and just try and get them in a place where it's clear to see what I mean, and then I'll speak to you in a sec. Okay, so for instance, now I've got the neck in, but let's just say that we want her to have a more bottom-heavy face. Now, that's pretty easy. We've got that square still there. All we need to do is widen that thin line. So instead of it angling in from the cheekbones, we just have to make it angle out. And so you can see the minute I do that, she looks a little bit more bottom heavy, maybe a bit more of a heavy chin or a bit of more of a chubby face maybe. And so, like I said, that does a lot for the likeness. And the same stuff goes for stuff like the forehead and the cheekbones. It's always good to see if somebody has a heart-shaped face, so wide forehead and a narrow chin, or is the cheekbones the widest point? Usually it is, but it's just good to look at what's the widest point and how they compare to each other. And like I said, this goes for every feature, so let's do some experimenting with the forehead and see how that changes her likeness as well. And the same thing goes for the nose as well. So the nose could be straight like that, so quite high up, starting quite high up in the eye socket. Or we could try something slightly different and make the eye socket a little bit higher and make the nose start higher. And you can see that makes it look more like a Greek sort of nose. And finally, we can also try bringing her nose down. So bringing the bridge of the nose, the start of the nose down. And then just gives a completely different view of the way we see her nose. So those small changes make a big difference for someone's likeness. Right, so now I'm okay with most of the placements of my features. So I'm gonna start shading in now and give her some hair and then get back to you in a second. Okay, so this pose we're going to take a little bit further than we did the 10-minute one. So I want to talk a little bit more about individual features and how you can make them look more like the person. So the lips are generally this sort of shape. So they're higher in the middle and lower on the sides, and they have a little corner on the very end. And that corner is very important because it might be low, it might be high, it might curve up, and that says a lot about someone's likeness. Similarly with the nose, it's very important to look at how wide the nose is at the base. Does someone have wider nostrils or more narrow nostrils? And I try to line that up with the corners of the mouth and the eyes. So in her case, the corners of her mouth are substantially more wide than her nose, which is quite narrow, which sort of lines up with the inner corner of her eyes on both sides. Next, I'm just going to draw in the eyes. For me, the easiest way to do that is to draw a half moon shape for the top of the eyes, Usually that highest point is where the pupil is located. So if she's looking left, that highest point will be on the left. If she'd be looking right, that highest point will be on the right. So I try to follow that. And then what I try to do is create a kind of rough ball shape underneath that, because the eyes are of course not flat, they're round shapes. So I try to put that in. And she may look a bit funny at the moment, but it's just, for me, it helps to have that in there so I can build on top. Okay, so now I've got the eyes in. I'm gonna start adding some details. This is a good time to have fun. You should have had everything in by now. That's the more structural, so the more boring stuff. And now you can have fun with adding in the eyes and the pupils and stuff. So I'll do that for a while. In the meantime, if you have any questions or anything is unclear, let me know in the comments, and I'll try and answer as soon as I can. Okay, so this brings us near the end of the 20-minute pose. And what I'm gonna do just for fun is add some white chalk. This is completely optional, don't worry if you don't have it. I just really enjoy working on a sort of tone paper and then just adding light and darks in there. A bit more like painting. But like I said, it's completely up to you and completely optional. All right, that's the end of it for the 20-minute pose. How did you guys feel about the tilted head? Was it difficult or not too bad? Okay, so here we are for the last pose already. And first of all, I just want to explain what I'm going to do in the last pose. I'm going to start with the same box method with almost the same measurements as we had in the second pose, because this is also a slight 3/4 view. So I'm not really going to re-explain that. I hope that was clear from the last one, but of course, as always, if it's not entirely clear, just let me know in the comments and I'll help you out. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the likeness. And finally, I will be doing some white chalk. If you're just using pencil and you don't have access to white chalk, you can also do the same effect by just smudging with your finger the edge between the shadow and the light. But we'll chat about that when we're there. So let's get started with this drawing. Okay, so now at this point I have my box in. I've got the cross on the side. I've got the midpoint of the front plane and the side plane. And I've got the center line, which is a little bit off center because she is looking away from us. Now what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to put in the curve of her head on the top, as well as the widest point of the cheekbone versus the chin and her eye socket. Okay, so now I've got a skull shape in that I can be happy with. I have checked the width of her cheekbone versus the width of her chin, the width of her forehead, so the brow line versus the cheekbone, which is pretty much on one line on her. I can start putting in the neck and shoulders, just carving into that box. And what helps me is to see how that lines up with other places of her face. So you can see that her neck sort of lines up just behind that center line, and then after that what I can start doing is start shading. And what I like about this way of drawing is that you can imagine that box is a big bunch of clay and you're just sort of molding it and scraping things off to create that likeness. I don't know if this makes sense, but this is how I think of it and it helps me a lot. Okay, so now I've got my big ball of clay sorted and I've got all of my big planes in, and I'm pretty happy with the general face shape that I have. So like some people might have a heart shape, people might have a wide chin, so she's got a narrow chin. Her cheekbones are the same as her brow line, so and she's got a nice sloping forehead. So that's sort of what I try to do at this stage. And then now we're going to start breaking down the features and the likeness of each feature, just like we did in the second pose. So first I'm going to start with figuring out her nose. So where does it start? Does it start halfway the eye sockets or does it start lower than the eye socket? And the width of that brow line, is it far away from each other? So brows start closer to each other. And then also trying to figure out the width of the nose. And once I've got those big shapes, then I can have some fun and add some details on top of that. So the darker accents. Okay, so now I have the darker accents in her eyes and I'm happy with the shape of the nose and the eyes. And now what I can do is start putting the corners of the mouth in, like we spoke about in the second pose. So just figuring out, are the corners of her mouth lower? Does she have a thicker upper lip, more narrow upper lip, that sort of thing. And then we just sort of have a bold version of her. So I'm now going to add some hair. Okay, so now I've got a little bit of a likeness, I've got the hair in, and have a look at your drawing at this point and just have a look and see if you feel like it starts to look like her a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just see if you can sort of see something of her in there. If you're not entirely sure, double check the measurements of the width of the cheekbone versus the chin versus the forehead. That's usually a big one. And if that doesn't fix it, have a look at the proportions of the chin versus the nose versus the forehead and the width of those features as well. And that's usually the biggest hurdle in getting a likeness. And after that, what we're going to do is soften some of these quite harsh shapes using your finger or a brush or something and just rubbing those into the paper a bit. And that's going to give us a bit more of a soft turn so she doesn't feel quite that harsh. Just going to do a quick cleanup of the rubber there, just getting rid of some excess line. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some chalk. This is really just for fun. And if you have a pencil, what you can do instead is rub through the shadows. That will make the side of the shadow a little bit darker, which is essentially the same as what I am doing, which is making the lights a little bit lighter. So what this is doing is it just gives a little bit more of a sense of that the lights are coming towards you and the darks are receding. So that gives us a little bit more of an illusion of roundness in her face. And especially since she has a female face, she's going to have more rounded forms than a male face would have. So I found it quite helpful to do. Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, or you can take your finger, and just start smudging all the edges. And this just helps them to make them a little bit rounder and a little bit flatter, which makes the focus more on her face. this point, I've got all my big stuff in. So what I'm going to do is put some lines down that I think are a little bit more accurate, then go in and smudge a little bit, and then put in more detail, and then smudge that again, and then put in more detail. And slowly she will start looking more detailed, but also not harshly detailed, nice and soft. And that will help a lot with the likeness as well. So at this point, this is just repeating, adding in some shapes, smudging them, and then adding in more shapes. I know that some of you requested a slightly different method this week because I used the box again, but I had this video already shot, but I have shot a new one using the Loomis method of constructing head, so that's something to look forward to next week. If you have any other suggestions, let me know in the comments. And also, did you find this helpful with creating a detailed head or not so much? Did you feel like you had a good likeness at the end or a better likeness than normal? Or was it still pretty hard? Let me know.
Thank you for taking part. Don't forget to photograph your work and post it on Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. I'd like to thank Lizet for drawing along with us today, and you can download the photographs you've seen in this week's session from the link I'm about to show you on the screen. You can follow us on Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget to like this video if you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Goodbye. As well as regular portrait drawing sessions, we run online live drawing sessions. The next one is on Wednesday the 20th of May at 8 PM and is entitled Adrian, the Man in the Mirror.